Hello and welcome. A few people at my job expressed interest in PC gaming, which got me down that rabbit hole of watching videos on different builds and whatnot. So I decided to go ahead and put one together. I had Friday off. I was going out of town to watch that My Hero Academia movie, and I just kind of caved in and bought a bunch of computer parts. So I bought a computer, put it together. I have one of the guys is kind of testing it out, see if he likes it. I think he's going to return it because he's barely played it, but I'll go ahead and go over the specs and some quick benchmarks that I ran before I gave it to him. Okay, so I got a Ryzen 5 2600X. It was only $99. I guess that they're kind of moving the product because the 1600X has a refresh that's cheaper. And this price is $72, but I got it for less. I think $152 combined, 20% off at Micro Center, so that was a pretty good deal. This motherboard is pretty bare bones. I'm not even sure if you can overclock it or not, but it was cheap, so I went ahead and got that. If I was getting it for myself, I'd have got something a little bit fancy. I should have bought something with Wi-Fi, but I didn't even think about that until afterwards. And it's 16 gigabytes of DDR4. Yeah, this was priced at $69. I almost got this Trident RAM. I really wanted to get that. I had that in my other build, but I couldn't really justify spending $30 for, like a low budget build. That's really I'm planning to give away. So yeah, I bought the memory for the SSD for $39. I could have got it for $32, but I didn't purchase it online. And this video card was used, so it was so cheap, $103. I had to pick it up. You can see the yellow stickers there, so it had probably been marked down a couple of times, but it seems to work. I did have some issues though, so it might have been with that graphics card, but I'm not sure. And this is just a 2 terabyte Seagate drive, nothing too special. I haven't actually built this computer yet. I have all the parts in my old case, but here are some of the stuff that I've ordered. It's all shown up by now. Discount the RGB fans and the cooling solution. That's not really necessary. But yeah, I got a 2 terabyte hard drive, $50, SSD for $40, memory card $69, and so on and so forth. I did a lazy conversion of the prices. I didn't actually check foreign markets to see what everything was going for, but you can get an idea. If you're Canadian, just add $100 for everything. I had some problems with this motherboard, kind of getting that CPU mounted. Other than that, it was a breeze, but that little screw right there just would not go in. It took me like an hour or two just fighting with it before I finally figured out how to get it in there. So I might have to replace the cooling solution, but I might just say screw it and just leave it as it is. But you shouldn't have that problem, but I would be a little wary. But it booted the first time, at least the first time I actually hooked everything up properly. So that was nice and easy. I was very, very happy. The first game I decided to check out was a Devil May Cry 5, since that's a game that seemed to run really, really well on low-end builds and high-end builds. So I'm running everything. Pretty much all these games I'm going to try are running at stock, on the stock settings on the CPU, stock settings on the GPU. On a RX 570, sorry. 4 gigabytes of RAM. So you're pretty much just going to see the video usage max out on pretty much everything. The GPU max out on everything, the VRAM and the GPU. But the CPU, the 2600X, seems to be handling these games pretty well. As you can see here, we're getting really high frame rates. I don't have VSync on. I noticed a lot of frame tearing, but I'll get into that later. So yeah, it's running 126 plus frames. It drops down to maybe in the 80s, but it seems to be pretty solid. I didn't notice any problems playing the game. Nice and smooth. I actually played through the first stage, but I forgot to record it, so I had to come back and do it again. But yeah, see, it's moving perfectly fine. This is a pretty darn good game. You should check it out if you haven't played it. Although I did run into my very first issue while playing this game. It should come up pretty soon here after this little combat sequence.
I've got some cleaning up.
So as you can see right there, it just crashed, just a random crash. Now I'm not sure if that's the CPU, the GPU, or something in the build, or the afterburner or whatever, but I had this crash when I first started testing games, game after game after game crash. Although when I tried playing it again the next day I hadn't had any crashes, so I'm not really sure if it's something with the hardware or if Windows was just installing stuff in the background since it's a fresh install. But it seems to be stable, but I'll have to play it a little bit more once I get the unit back. Also, all these games are recorded using direct capture, so the frame rate should be pretty accurate. I have Afterburner on to record the stats. Everything else is recorded direct feed to an Elgato at HD 60, so it shouldn't impact the frame rate that much. Now, Resident Evil 2 is a game that runs pretty well as well. I didn't really have to change anything, although I think Steam kind of imported my settings, but everything was pretty much high. The video RAM usage went down, obviously, since I have a 1080 in my main card, which I think has 8 gigabytes of RAM. This card only has 3, so it did go down to 3, but I didn't even really notice a difference. As you can see, it's high frame rates. It's in the 70s here. It kind of goes up and down. Although this is a sewer stage, so that's not going to impact the frame as much, but the game runs fine. No hiccups, no problems that I noticed.
Freeze! I'll shoot!
And it's a pretty graphically intensive game, so I was pretty impressed by what the 570 can do.
Son of a bitch.
Don't mind my aim here. I'm just warming up.
This is out of control.
Now this scene I was expecting to have some drops and all the flame and the zombies, but it handles it pretty good. So I imagine this is, from my memory, this is about the most intensive part of the game. So it seems to be able to handle that no problem. So you should be able to play this with no issues. High frame rate. I could everything is set high, so I can bump down the stats and get even better performance. But you don't really need to. It's solid, and I'd play like this. And as you can see, it's only using like 20% or so of the CPU, so there's still room to like even push it harder with a better video card, assuming the game can even go that high. Now Dark Souls, I just left it at 60, 1080p 60. There aren't a lot of customization settings. Now you can bump everything up, but you have to go and like get mods and hack the INI files and all that stuff. I didn't really feel like doing all that. I only had this computer for like a day before I had to hand it off, so I wanted to just quickly benchmark a few things to see how it runs. So I ran this, yeah, as you can see, 1080p 60, no frame dips. Well, I mean, I think it drops to 57 at one point, but other than that, it seems to be pretty darn solid. Everything maxed out. Now, as you can see, there's a little slight dip somewhere around here, yeah, right there. But other than that, it just goes right back up. Even though I'm gonna like run around the arena a little bit, and it seems to be handling everything fine. I should have hit the boss a few times to get it into its second form with like these big tentacles and whatnot, but I didn't think about that at the time, so I just kind of ran around a little bit, and jumped off the cliff. So here's Skyrim. I also just ran it at 1080p 60. I'm just going through here to see all the settings are at ultra. Now it also had a few little frame dips, but it pretty much was solid, so you can run everything up or turn it down. You run it even higher. Now I did when I did my first run through this, I had like a perfect Bethesda error where a RAM just fell out of the sky. But for some reason, it didn't record. I guess I must have turned it off or something. So I was kind of pissed that I missed that moment. So I ran back here. You might see me looking off to the left because I kept looking, like hoping that maybe it would fall again, but it did not. But as you can see, everything's running pretty steady. I switched to a third person in a moment. So I haven't tried this modded. I think when I get the computer back, I'm going to try and put a bunch of graphical mods on this and then see if it takes a hit or not. I imagine it will, but I still have faith that it'll run pretty solid, pretty close to 60, maybe if I bumped a few things down, but I think it'll handle it. Now granted, Skyrim is a pretty old game, but it's always nice to pop this in, and it always makes me want to play it, but never say never, but I'm probably never going to play that again. I invested so many hours into this game. With the settings pretty much on epic, high, everything. Now this game I was expecting to run like a piece of cake, since it's not a very graphically intensive game and it seems to run on pretty much everything. But as you can see, it was having some issues staying steady. I'm not really sure why that is. But perhaps it's a VRAM issue. I'm not all that tech savvy, so I could probably tweak it a little bit. I do play with the settings a little bit, but it seems to go fairly steady up here. But you'll see as I get closer to the ground, the frame rate will kind of drop a little bit, which is kind of odd. I'm not really sure why that happens, but so when I get down, I go ahead and change the settings a little bit to make it a little bit better. But this is perfectly playable. If you're not a snob about frame rate, you can play it like this. But for me personally, I would rather lower the settings just a little bit to get a smoother run. Now I turn a few things down. Still pretty high, but a little bit down. It seems to be running quite a bit smoother here. So I thought this is pretty ideal. I mean, I do bump the settings down a little bit lower later, but I think most people would be happy playing the game like this. Gotta take down this Black Widow knockoff. Now here's where I notice the first problem with this card, at least with my settings. See if you can tell. Now I don't know if you noticed or not, but there's quite a bit of screen tearing with this card. I'll slow it down here. If you see as I get near the wall, you can very clearly see the screen tearing. There's a lot of it. I noticed that in a lot of games. Now when I was playing, I didn't really see it that much, but when I went back and reviewed the footage, you can clearly see like join ghost. It's like split at the top and split at the top of that pillar. And that's pretty much in everything. Now you can turn VSync on, you can lower the graphical settings, like right there the pillars are split as well. But it was a pretty consistent issue that I saw, which I'm not accustomed to seeing. Now I personally have a FreeSync monitor, so it wouldn't really matter. But if you don't have something like that, it might be an issue. You might have to tone the graphics down a little bit, or if you don't care, I would just play it like that and just go. Now here's Apex Legends. Now I wasn't sure about adaptive resolution. I think the higher that is, the more it kind of like lowers and raises the resolution to make the game run smooth and look better. So I turned it off, all the way off. I think it's the correct setting to make the GPU do all the work without the aid. Now as you can see, the frame rate is kind of taking a hit here, but after I landed, it seemed to go pretty well. As you can see, the frame rate is great. A little bit drops here and there depending on the angle, but it's pretty consistent, pretty high up in the 50s, 60s. When I drop down, it'll be a little closer to the 80s. But this is totally playable. Now, unfortunately, I was unable to get into a firefight, because this is one of the first games I tested and it crashed on me, so I couldn't get that footage. As you can see, I'm running around, everything seems fine.
Faster, faster, faster.
Although I was playing on a controller, so it was probably a mercy that the game crashed, because I did not want to have to run around on the first-person shooter on the PC with the controller, but I didn't have a proper setup. I was using a little touchpad keyboard, so that was kind of awkward. Now, yeah, pretty solid frames here. There's also some screen tearing, but I'll get into that a little bit more later. Okay, now here's Overwatch. Now I didn't turn the adaptive frame rate thing off, because I still wasn't quite sure what that did. So you'll have to bear with me on that. Also, again, I didn't have a keyboard or mouse, so I was playing with the controller. So I didn't go into a proper game, because I didn't want to bring my team down and get them all killed. But other than that, you know, everything's turned up pretty high. I think I went with more or less the default settings. And the game ran fairly smooth up into the hundreds. I did have a few dips down into 90, but other than that, it was pretty high up there. And really with this card, it's really more of a a 1080p 60 frame per second card is not really there for bumping up really high frame rates and whatnot, especially with only 4 megabytes of VRAM. But I was pretty happy with this performance, and as you can see, the CPU is pretty low on the usage. It's mostly the GPU that's taking the hit. Now here is the first just like regular benchmark I ran. Now this was after I had a few crashes, so I wasn't really sure if it was Afterburner or not, so I decided to turn Afterburner off when I was running these tests, and I kind of completely forgot about it. So that's why you don't see the stats up at the top. But this is running on the high settings, full screen, the Final Fantasy 14 benchmark, and it seems to be handling it pretty well. And I love this game. I mean, I don't love Final Fantasy 14, but I did love this expansion. It was a lot of fun. Like the first 2-3 months this game came out, I did nothing but play it. I remember I went to like Anime Expo, and it was like go to Anime Con during the day, come home, come to my Airbnb and play Shadowbringers, go to sleep, repeat. It was a pretty good time. I would be curious how this card handles the game during a boss raid. So that's really when the frame rate really takes a hit, when there's a bunch of characters on screen. Now during their benchmark it shows a bunch of people, but I'm not really sure how it would actually hold up during an actual raid. But I would have to log in and get my gear caught up and relearn how to play the game. You know, that MMO nonsense. Why don't I actually play them all that much? So I haven't done that, but I may do that when I do more benchmarks, just to kind of see how it'll handle like real game performance. But it scored pretty high. And really with this game you could turn the settings down to medium and it'd pretty much look about the same and it would run a lot smoother.
You're good. You're good.
I decided to go ahead and run the Final Fantasy 15 benchmark. It wasn't really necessary considering I have some Final Fantasy 15 gameplay later in the video, but I figured, hey, why not? I have it on my computer. Let's I downloaded it, might as well run it. Now this game is one where even on my current build, which is at 8700K with a 1080 GTX,
let's hit it.
It struggles on this game, at least, well, at the higher resolutions anyway, but I guess 1080p, it could probably handle it okay. So I was very curious to see how this machine ran. It's struggling a little bit, but it is doing the job. I still have to play the DLC for this game. I don't know, is it any good? I think I have some of it, I just don't have the final piece. So I haven't played through the game on the PC yet. I've only played through it on console. And here's a little combat scene. Seems to be running pretty smooth, pretty enjoyable. I totally see myself playing through the game this way. Although this action looks really cool, but when you're actually playing the game, you're just holding down the circle button, so don't be fooled. Now here's Shadow of the Tomb Raider. I decided to just run the standard benchmark. I turned Afterburner back on because this was the next day. Everything seemed to be running fine, so I went ahead and did this test again. Settings pretty high. Now this card, the 570, doesn't support DirectX 12, so I wasn't able to test out how that ran, but on DirectX 11 on everything, it runs pretty good. So as you can see, this frame rate is pretty high in the 50s, 60s. I can totally handle this game. Now looking at the benchmark chart, it runs pretty good, even according to the game, so you really wouldn't have to do anything. You could just run it as is. Now The Witcher I didn't really mess with that much. I mean, it's pretty much mandatory that you boot up The Witcher if you're doing a benchmark test. So I went ahead and got it, put it in, more or less went to let it set on the default when it registered as being okay. I could have turned some of this stuff off, I probably should have, but I figured, we'll just see how it runs. So the post-processing, everything's pretty much default for the automatic settings. and it runs pretty good. As you can see, it stays around 60s. It does drip down into the 50s as it ran around the city at certain parts, but it was mostly in the 60s, and it dropped down a little bit in combat. I didn't really mess with it too much. I just ran around for like 15 minutes, but it was pretty consistent. I would probably turn the settings down a little bit just to get it a little more stable, but it will still look good either way. And as you can see, the CPU is barely being used. At 2600 is a pretty good beast for modern gaming. Now I jumped off here to do some combat, but it turned out to be pretty pathetic, so I decided to go ahead and cut this short. I'd have to actually relearn how to play the game to actually do something fancy, but I might do that and look for some of the bigger bosses or enemy types. But yeah, this is a hell of a game. Next I ran Nier Automata. Now this is a game where I noticed the screen tearing really bad. I'll get into that in just a little bit, but this game runs pretty well on this card and CPU.
Intel,
I'm not running the FAR mod, which is, if you don't know, this game is very unoptimized for PC. It runs like garbage, but it's running stock, no mods or anything. It still runs pretty good. Frame rate's pretty high. I think it drops down into the 40s at some parts, but it's otherwise fairly consistent, totally playable. And in a little bit, I'm going to turn on VSync, and you'll see that it still just runs great. So you could pretty much play this as is. Of course, you would want to go find the FAR mod and turn that on. You can turn off some of the settings and make it run even smoother. But this is totally a good way to play the game. This card can really handle its own here. I really need to finish this game. I went to the concert for it. They had like a concert in North America and a few other places. It's pretty good. They played a lot of music from the first game, and they got a lot of music from the second game as well. I think a lot of people will probably be confused because they never played the original Nier.
Since they both came all this way out here, they're gonna say a few words of greeting.
ニアの生みの親、ディレクターの横太郎さんです。
This is Director Yoko Taro of Nier.
But that was a kind of a nice surprise, kind of a bit of a bummer, because one of my favorite songs was not actually in concert. This Cannot Continue the song. But other than that, it was a pretty good show. And yeah, everything's turned up pretty high. I think this was the default settings for this. And as you can see, the frame rate is at 60. It does dip, but it runs pretty good. No, I don't recall if I had VSync on or not when I did this combat part. Probably not, because I was toggling it on and off and running and fighting a different group. So it might be on at this point, it might be off. But as you can see, the frame rate is still pretty good. Now here you can see the screen tearing really bad. So this game is pretty noticeable. So I would probably suggest having VSync on while playing this, or turning the settings down, or whatever you can do to eliminate that problem or tone it down. Now back to Final Fantasy 15 again. Now this is some like actual gameplay. Now I tried playing it on high. It didn't really handle it very well. So as you can see, it's pretty much set to average. I could probably turn it down more or turn off some other stuff. But I feel like this is perfectly playable. As you can see, this is totally the normal version of the game. Nothing has been changed here. So I'm just running around. As you can see, the frame rate is in the 70s. It drops down a little bit, but it stays pretty high all throughout. I just run up here and I do one battle.
The hunt is on.
And the card seems to be able to handle everything, all these enemies on screen. There's some pausing, some issues, but that's otherwise fairly good, fairly smooth playing.
Here I am.
You're on fire today!
Well,
Now this is another game that the card really struggled with. When I played through the opening intro section, it was going around 45 to up, 45 and up, so I was really struggling. So I was playing on the high, I think the default settings, but I had to turn this down quite a few times in order to get something playable. I still wasn't very happy with the way it ran. Now if you like to play at 30 frames per second, you can probably crank everything up and go, but if you're trying to maintain a solid 60, doesn't seem like it can be done, at least not out of the box. I'd probably have to modify a few things, read a few message boards to find out. But as you can see here, the frame rate really takes a dip. So I'll go into the options and I try and turn down a few things, but more or less keep everything up high just to kind of see how it'll run. But it still wasn't really having a big effect. So I'll go back in, and the frame rate goes up a little bit, but it's still dropping down. So I think I'd go ahead and turn down the settings a little bit more. Eventually I try setting everything to low, and it's kind of like, it'll do, but it's not ideal. So I probably recommend getting a better video card for this, because as you can see, the GPU and the VRAM are maxed out on this game, even with everything set to low. But the game looks nice, and if you don't mind, this is a pretty decent way to play the game. Now lastly, I went ahead and booted up Cemu. Now, I didn't bother to actually properly modify the files, and whenever you play this emulator, you have to play it a little bit to download shader caches. You can have to go get custom graphic packs to really boost the frame rate and performance. Now this is going stock because I couldn't get all my files to transfer over, and also I wasn't sure how to set up an AMD card, because since my main card is a NVIDIA. So if optimized, this game will probably run a lot better, but I don't have Vulkan on, and I don't have a lot of the mods and whatnot, so just running more or less the standard with a few tweaks on here. It's going maybe in the high 20s. Can't really get better than that. And the graphics aren't quite as good as it should be, but I'm sure if I tweak it a little bit, I can probably get it to run a lot smoother with anti-aliasing on and everything. But it looks, it's perfectly playable like this. I think the regular Wii U version of this game only runs around 20 frames per second, so it's already running better, even emulated default settings. So yeah, that's pretty much it for this build. I need to go and test it some more, so I might have another video coming up within a week or two once I get the machine back. I can run more tests. I also ended up ordering a 580. Since, I wanted to try an 8GB card. I wasn't going to do it, but I caved in and went ahead and bought it. So that should be arriving in a few days from now. So maybe in a week or two, I'll do another test just to I'll test this card a little bit more of the 574 gig, and I'll test the 588 gig and kind of see if either of these cards are pretty much good enough or if they're more or less the same. But otherwise, that should do it for this video. Thank you for watching, and hopefully you'll check out more. Bye.